Okay, good morning. We are on page 144 in Hemshech Tzadik Daled, which we're going to conclude today and go back to 47, 11, 58, I'm sorry. 1157, 1158, okay. So for those that are either first time coming to the class or it's always good to follow the actual text, which I read the Hebrew and then explain in English. You go to ayinbeis.com and we have scanned all the PDF format where you can either follow online or print out. So on page 144, in what's called the Hemshech Tzadik Daled, this is a series of discourses. The year 1933, corresponding to the Hebrew year 4, Tafresh Tzadik Daled. And it follows along and is almost word for word with courses delivered and written by the Rebbe Rashab, the Friedrich Rebbe's father, the fifth Chabad, and that began in the Shavuos 1912, corresponding to Tafresh Ayin Beis 5756. We are now is already 5676, which is a little years ago. We've been learning it from back over 8 years ago, 9 years ago. We began when it was the centennial of the beginning, 1912, 2012. Approximately then we began 2011. Just a little background. Okay, so now that's the big picture. Now getting it back to the specifics. We are right now, I'll review what we learned yesterday and then continue on. So we are in a longer discussion on the concept of how there are two perspectives at existence. One is called Das Elyon. It's a perspective from above, how the divine, how God sees reality, our reality. And there's the perspective from below, Das Tachten, how we see the higher reality, including God. And that is Das Tachten. He explained that there's Yesh, Ayin, Yesh. Everything is structured, everything in the entire cosmic order, in existence and beyond the cosmic order, is structured in three major steps. Yesh is the source, that's the producer, the creator. The Yesh Hamiti, that's the true existence, which is the true existence of the divine of God, the essence of the divine of Atzmos. There's the Yesh HaNivra, which is the created Yesh, our existence. And there's an Ayin in between. Ayin is essentially a state of bittul, a state of like a type of interface, he calls it, a mamutza, like a field of energy, oyer, that connects the two. This middle level divides into two. One is an Ayin that is reflective of its source, and one is an ayin that relates to the creation, to the product. This ayin now itself also has a consciousness. What's its consciousness? It's bittul. That's what ayin means, bittul. We learned that there's a difference between the ayin, the first level of ayin, and the second level. The first level is completely nullified in the presence of its, completely nullified, in contrast to its source. The second level of ayin, which relates to existence, why is it called ayin? Because it's not of the same substance as the yesh. It's a entity that's beyond us, and as well as it's not understood. It's mysterious. It's not musig. It's not understood. So we call it ayin, not ayin as in nothing, but an ayin as beyond and outside of our realm of experience, direct experience. Now, in this bittul itself, which is called which is a state of bittul, it introduces a type of sense of selflessness is antithetical to yesh, because the yesh is about self. What would we can't exist if we don't have a sense of self. That's self-conscious. That's consciousness. is ourself. Ayin's consciousness is not about itself, it's about its source. And the purpose of that is to teach us how to achieve a state of such higher awareness. Higher awareness, which is not about our own survival and our own needs, but to recognize there's something greater than we are. And there's levels in this. The Rebbe Rashab is going to enumerate 4 different levels or types of bittul. We're finishing now the second type, and I'll explain that in a moment. Then there'll be 2 more. And Tzadik Dal follows obviously the same structure. But as we'll learn in the next Maimer, which is going to be a while after we go back to Ayin Beis, we'll come back. We'll see that the Frierdiker Rebbe did not conclude his hemshech, his discourse, his series of discourses. So we end only after number 3. But Ayin Beis continues with number 4. So we're going to be talking about the 3rd level shortly in this class. But let me finish summing up the 2nd level. So after explaining the first type of bittul is what? The bittul, what he called heder tfisas mokim, that oir, in the presence of its and awareness of its and cognizance of its source, is completely nullified. Like the candle is nullified in the face of the sun. Like a lesser chacham, wise person, is completely nullified, has no standing, and doesn't have any sense of self in the presence of someone, his teacher, or someone far greater than he. That's level 1 of bittul. The second level, as the Frierdiker Rebbe explained, and we learned this in the previous pages, especially the beginning of this Maimer, back on page 138, if you want to go back to it. The second level of the Frierdiker Rebbe, using the words of his father, the Rebbe Rashab and Ayin Beis, is the first level is only about its contrast relative to its source. It has no standing. But this student, when he's on his own, this chacham, or like the candle doesn't get extinguished. It doesn't not exist. It doesn't have functionality. It's gilui, and its function is nullified because the candle has no value when you have sunlight. But shut off the sunlight, and you're in the dark night or in a dark room, the candle absolutely continues to burn and illuminate. So its bittul is not about itself. It's about its contrast to its source. In the second level or second type of bittul, he says it's the thing itself, itself. Its own mitzias recognizes that I have no existence of my own. My whole existence comes from the source, and without the source, I would not be. So that's now the itself is sensing that. A candle doesn't feel that. A candle is nullified because the light of the sun is greater than the candle. But the candle doesn't say my light comes from sunlight and I don't exist if there's no sun. That's not the language. That's not that level. Second level of bittul has that aspect to it. And what does that teach us? So this is what we learned the last few pages, beginning literally on page 139, and we just concluded it yesterday on page 144. What was the discussion? How we see this b'muchesh in Avodah, that we also have an example of this bittul in our own. The Yesh has an example of this bittul, and what is that? The contemplations, the 2 primary contemplations of Mo Rabu Masecha Hashem, how multitude, how many are your creations, God, and Mo Godlu Masecha, how great are they? How their quality and their sheer size, which teaches us a deeper lesson. But both of them, when we contemplate on it, teach us that our yesh, that we're not self-made entities. We could not exist, and we definitely could not perpetuate, especially in this type of permanent way, which means that there's no diminishing. The species lasts, kayomim b'min, and the earthly creatures, tzva aretz. The tzva shamayim kayomim b'ish. Each individual continues to perpetuate without change, without shift. Possible when you're talking about Balei Gvul, finite, limited creatures subject to change, subject to erosion, subject to death, because there's a koyach habli gvul that is causing it to continue to perpetuate and orbit in a consistent way. And then yesterday we learned also additional point that the coordination of all these tzva hashamayim, the celestial bodies, their coordination, that though they are different entities, and its own function, and its own spirit, and its own purpose, however, work like an orchestra, coordinated and synchronized by a conductor, one outside of them that is essentially governing and ruling that they should all work together toward one purpose, toward one end. Like somebody, like he said, a human body is one entity. So all the limbs and organs all function together. Even that's also a chiddush, though he doesn't discuss it here, discussed in other places. But how much more so take a bunch of different human bodies, people with different interests. And you see that there's a director who takes them all together, brings together many different talents. Any project, any business, any venture, we have many different type of talents where on their own, they could easily clash because each one has their own agenda, egos and so on. But when you see a project really working, many fall apart, obviously, for that reason. So it's much more than just one body. One body God created in a way that they all work with each other. But when you take different bodies, which would be similar to the different celestial bodies, and they're all working like a symphony, an orchestra, different instruments, different musicians, and they're all working in one harmony, that tells you there's some force outside of them. You know, I used to ask the question, why do you need a conductor? You know, people who know how to play music, they can play music together, they know how to jam. Why do you need a conductor? You see a orchestra. And very clearly, because without the conductor, there's not going to be total synchronicity. Can they wing it? Can they pull it off? Yes, if they're professionals, they can do it because they know the rules, but there's something missing, something fundamental missing. So it's an exact example that in order to coordinate different entities, have different roles, you need something outside of them. So therefore, the tzva hashamayim, shamayim misaprim kavod keil, the heavens tell us a story. And he said the story is not just a story, it's a illumination from the word norin unetzitzin. It illuminates and it sparkles. What does it tell us? What does it illuminate for us? That there's a force, a divine force that is greater than it all, that's coordinating it all. And that divine force is bli gvul. That's what we concluded. So what do we see from this? That when the nivra, when we contemplate the creatures in this earth, contemplate on these ideas, including tzva hashamayim, the last words, I'll just read the last few lines. In other words, our true existence and our perpetuation and the movement of all our bodies and our coordination, everything we learned, is only due to the Ratzon HaBeira. In other words, it's like the sense of Oyer that we're sensing we're not self-made entities. The entities themselves, when you think about them, dictate and testify to something that is controlling them, something that is creating them and designing them and keeping them coordinated. So you come to a state of yeh b'bchinas bitl ba'atzmei. That would cause the nivra, the yesh, to sense a bitl ba'atzmei, a sense of awe. But you can say bitl here, which means a sense of and being nullified and being recognizing that it's not all about me. Bitl ba'atzmei, a bitl. Dugma kedugmas habitl ba'er b'zeh. This is like the example for the oyer. In the fact she'ena mitziyusim ma'atzmei kimim kere, that it's not an existence on its own. It's not it's only due mimkere. It's coming from a source. However, what's the difference between the nivroim and oyer? She says because it's not a total nullification, and it's also we still remain a yesh. That's our nature. But now the yesh has now tasting and experiencing something of awe. There's something beyond me, greater than I am. The oyer, which is a fundamentally from the outset, doesn't require contemplation. Sublime ethereal entity Nikra bitl b'mitzia shalei. It's called a bitl in its very existence. Existence is personifies and embodies bitl. That's what oid is. That's what he says. Okay. And these last words actually in Ayin Beis on page, as I said, 1157. The Rebbe Rashab actually added something here that the Frierdiker Rebbe did not include. If you look at the bottom of page 1157, he included, this is the in of Yirum Hashem Kol Ha'aretz v'Yiru Es Hashem Kadeshav. These two levels of bittul, Yira Chitzenius, meaning more of an outer type of awe, and Yira Pnimius, a more deeper one. So he says that's the difference between Oyer the Oyer and Bittul Hayesh of the Nivra. Okay. Rebbe Rashab also added that this is Ein Zuloscha, the Mibiladoi Ein Shum Mitzias Klal. Without him, there's no existence at all. So what I'm going to do now, because we learned the beginning of the Maimer, because it's somewhat relevant, I'm just going to read this last paragraph on page 144, and then return to Ayin Beis to type 3 of Bittul. But before I read, continue, anybody want to ask or want any clarification or any comment? No? Okay, good. Fine. So here we go. So if you remember the beginning of the Maimer, the beginning of this discourse started on the pasuk, on the tefillah rather, the prayer, Ein arech lecha Hashem lekecha be'elam haza ve'en zuloscha malkeinu lechai elam habo. So he spoke that the difference, elam haza, we sense the ein arech, the infinite distance between of atzmus, but from Ur you don't sense ein arech, you don't sense an infinite distance. What does Ur teach you? It teaches us only ein zuloscha, that there's nothing, there's no other than you, because my whole existence is dependent on you. So it's an interesting contrast. The Yesh teaches us that atzmus must be of a completely different reality if it can create something like us. That's a foreign entity that doesn't even recognize on its own its source. Ur can't teach us that because Ur tells us only about its source. So what does tells us that existence is dependent completely, but you. There's no other but you. My whole existence is dependent on you. That's what he said at the beginning of the Maimer. The difference in Gashmi and Ruchni. And then he brought the Avud Raham. I'm just reading on page 137 before we finish here. It said, this will be in the future, we will sense that our entire existence is dependent on God. Malkeinu, because it says, okay, fine. So I'm reading now on page 144, the last paragraph. And this is the meaning that we say in davening on Shabbos. In Elam Haza, in Arech, it's infinitely distant. From this world, this physical world, which is a Metzias Yesh, it's an existing entity, it has its own independent consciousness. That's Yesh. Besides the fact that you know Ein Arech, because to create such a Yesh could only come from something that's completely beyond, because how does it create something that doesn't have any sense and does not indicate on its source? It comes from a completely beyond state. So it says, besides that, Hine mitzvah ha'aretz, from the earthly creatures, anu yedim demola ha'aretz kinyanecha, we come to know that the world, mola ha'aretz, the world is filled with your possessions, your God's possessions. Like we discussed earlier, that kol hu elikus, everything is godly. That's the contemplation that we learned, that when you look at creation and you see its sheer multitude, and you see that every detail, its organization, and the Ashgacha Pratis, and the unity. He said that teaches us that everything is godliness. And then comes the second statement. Ve'ein zuloscha malkeinu l'chaya elam abba. And there's no other but you, Malkeinu, our king, l'chaya elam abba, which refers to the life in the world to come, not elam haza. What is that? Sheklalusehu b'chinas oir. That second phrase, in general, is referring to oir, shu mitzias ruchni. Now we're not talking about the yesh of elam haza. We're talking about a sublime, ethereal, spiritual entity, the oir. From the oir we know that your thoughts are very profound. Remember, ma'id amku comes from the second half of the verse. It says, Su'u more meinechem, ru'u mibara ela. Let me just look back at the language. Ma'id amku machshavesecha. Just a moment. I'm just looking at page 139. I want to see the exact language there. Yeah, and I'm sorry, not sumor menech. Mo gadlu mesecha vaya mo'id amku machshavesecha. That mo'id amku, how deep, very deep are your thoughts, is we recognize that dafka specifically from the celestial bodies, not from the earthly bodies. That's what he's saying now. So that's a deeper level of contemplation, a deeper appreciation. Delakus huakel. Not that everything is godliness, that godliness is everything. In other words, we talk from the perspective of godliness, because we get to understand a deeper sense of godliness and God's bleak vul and infinite power that is recognizable specifically more so in the celestial bodies. Ubaba soga gemura mitzvah shamayim. And this comes in a complete comprehension from the celestial bodies. You see it also in the earthly bodies in the fact that it perpetuates the species, but on a much higher level from the celestial bodies. Yeah. He's going to say that. In truth, also from the earthly creatures, we can know that there's a divine energy that is infinite because it perpetuates in species. But from the celestial bodies, it's more understood. It's more apparent. It's more. We also learned, if you remember, that it's also a qualitative higher understanding because the tzva shamayim, because of their size and their quality, teaches also more, like he said, chachmas hanefesh compared to chachmas hamaisa. He doesn't make mention of it here, but we learned that chachmas hanefesh, meaning you get to know more about the personality of the Creator, as opposed to chachmas hamaisa, you get to know more about the wisdom and intelligence invested in the craft, in the creation. Okay, v'ikar agilu yil asad lavi, and the primary revelation of this oir will be in the future. The ozhari ba'agashmi mamish yinira ha'emes k'meishahu, because that's when, in the gashmi mamish, literally in the physical entity, will be obviously this truth will become obvious. Now it requires contemplation and work and effort, but l'asad lavi, this will become revealed to all. The zeh b'yemahu yiyavaya chodesh mayachad, that the Avod Raham says, and that's when we say, and that day b'yemahu, and that day meaning in the future, Mashiach comes. L'asad lavi, it'll be havaya chad u'shmaya chad, that the unity of Havaya and the unity of His name will all be revealed. She'nira ha'achdus ha'amiti, the true unity of the divine, the elokus hu'akel. That will be obvious, the true unity, that godliness is everything. Not just that everything is godliness, but godliness is everything. Okay. So So this concludes page 144, Ayin in Tzadik Dalet. And we are now, I'm closing this sefer now, and I'm moving back to Ayin Beis, because we're going to move now to the Ofen HaShlishi, the third method, or the third type, and the third level of bittul. So I'm reading now, back to Ayin Beis, page 1158. Before we continue, any questions, or we move right on? Okay. Good. So it's the third line on page Aleph Kuf Nun Ches, 1158. If you need quickly, you can go to ayinbeis.com and you'll find the actual text. If you have the Sefer, great. So it's the third line, and you'll see Hagimel. This is Hagimel, means the third type of bittul. So the second type was discussed in Ayin Beis in middle of page 1157 to the top 1158. The first was discussed on page 1155 through 1157. And now on the top of 1158 begins Ofen Hagimel. If you want to mark it, you can mark it so you have a clear delineation and structure of the three. Okay, so he says Hagimel. So again, after explaining the first Ofen was what? Heder Tfisas Mokim. How is nullified in the presence of its source. Level 2, or a second type, deeper type, is that the Eir senses that it's not an existence of its own. Its entire existence is dependent on its source, and without the source, it doesn't exist. Ein zu lascha. He's now going to go Hagimel. Hagimel hu shabitul ba'eru b'chinis efes biltecha. The third expression in the davening was ein arech lecha ba'elam haza. So that's not really about bittul. That's more about just recognizing the infinite distance of atzmus. Ein zeloscha malkeinu l'chai elam haba. We just learned that. That's ein zeloscha. Ein zeloscha. Ein arech means you're infinitely ein arech. You're completely infinitely distant. Ein zeloscha means there's nothing like you. Ein zelosh, there's no other but you, because all of existence is dependent on you, which we just learned. Now he says the third level is called Efes Biltecha. Efes means zero, nothing without you. But here it said Ein Zuloscha, now it's Efes. Efes is deeper than Ein, than Ayin. And the word is Biltecha instead of Zuloscha. So that's the third stage, the third level. He's going to, of course, explain what it is. And the Frierdiker Rebbe in Tzadik Dalet in the next Maimer is going to elaborate on this pages upon pages. I believe also around 6-7 pages just on this section of a half a page here. So let's learn it first in Ayin Beis, and then we'll go back to Tzadik Dalet and learn it there. So first he just stated what's the level. Efes Biltecha. What does this mean? He says, V'nizbar le'il, and it was explained earlier above, Shezeu, Shegam ima atzmus lo yesh rak b'chinas atzmus. So he gives right away a headline what this means. We learned earlier that there's two levels. Let me state it first and then we'll learn it inside. We talked about that Eir feels and senses, its consciousness, that it does not have any existence of its own. Its entire existence is dependent upon its source. Were the source not there, it wouldn't exist. But we don't say that Eir doesn't exist when the source is there. We say without the source, there'd be no Eir. Remove the sun, and there's no sunlight. That's clear. But if there is a sun, there's also sunlight. Now he's going to teach us, Efes Biltecha teaches us that even when there's the source is there, Atzmus is there, there's nothing but Atzmus. So in level 2 that we learned before, we're saying without the source, the light doesn't exist. And therefore the light is constantly aware that I don't have anything of my own without the source. But with the source, I'm here as well, because I'm a reflection of the source. Now we're going to come to a point that even when the source is there, the light does not feel anything, only feels Atzmus itself. Now, I know it's a subtle difference. It sounds like a subtle difference, but it's actually a very powerful difference. And we'll discuss the difference shortly as we learn this inside. But that's what he says. So now it's the question of a bittul with a source. In the first level of bittul, if you remember, the entity altogether doesn't disappear. The candle doesn't disappear. The candle just simply doesn't have function because it's nullified in the presence of its source. The sunlight is so powerful. Or the greater chacham, the great wise one, he's nullified in front of a smaller chacham is nullified in front of a larger, but he exists. And as soon as the source, or in this case, the sun moves aside, the flame continues to burn. So not only does it exist, but also even when the source is there, it exists. It just does not function. It doesn't feel any purpose in its function, but it exists. In the second level, the senses, I don't exist. If there's no source, I'm not there. In the first level, the student or this chacham knows it's there, but I feel completely at loss and nullified in the presence of my teacher or the greater chacham. But it's not because I'm dependent on him. The second level says, no, if there's no source, I don't exist. The third level says, even with the source, and I exist because the source wants me to exist, I also don't have anything. All I am is just Atzmus. All that sense is Atzmus, not the entity itself. So this is, of course, a much deeper level of bittul. So you see the distinction. In level one, it exists, it's just its function is not there because there's a greater light shining. So it feels dark. Uchamhu, if you remember the language, ucham, it's darkened in face like a candle in the light of the sun. The second is that it exists only because there's a source exists, but without the source, it doesn't exist. And the third level is even with a source, the only thing that is sensed is atzmus, not the existence of this entity itself. So let's explain what this means. So even with atzmus, lo yesh rak b'chinas atzmus. Even when atzmus is there, the oir, there's nothing but atzmus. Whereas in level two, there is oir. That's completely dependent on atzmus, but it's there. Bittul elyon harbi yeser ma bittul de ein zoloscha. This is a far higher level of sublimation or nullification or selflessness, however you translate bittul, far more than level two of ein zoloscha. There's nothing, ein zoloscha means there's no other but you. Shezeu shabila doya atzmus ein mitziaser. The second level, ein zoloscha, meant that without atzmus, there's no oir. Take away atzmus, there's no oir. It doesn't have any existence of its own. Ki im ha'idei atzmus adafke. The oir is only possible because there's atzmus, through atzmus. The makol mokim hariyesh mitzias. She'enei atzmus. In that second state, ein zoloscha, you're saying there's no existence of oir without its source. But it doesn't say that there's no existence of oir, period. So, at the end of the day, there is something that is not atzmus, which is oir. Its existence is dependent only on atzmus. Take away atzmus, there's no oir. But you don't say there's no oir, you say there's oir. But the oir feels that it's completely dependent on its source, as opposed to level one, where it doesn't feel that, it's just nullified. In other words, there is a mitzias, but that mitzias knows that its existence is only through atzmus. Against level two, the nullification in this level, or the sublimation, selflessness, there the focus is that it's not a existence on its own. It's not a self-standing and self-contained existence. But rather, its entire existence is due to atzmus, the source. Canal. So what does Efes Biltecha add? Omnam, however, Efes Biltecha, the third level, the third type, who shagam ima atzmus, that even when atzmus is there, and the Eir therefore has standing because its entire existence is dependent on atzmus, but it's there, even when atzmus is there, emetzias Eir klal. It's not only when there's no atzmus there, there's no Eir. Even when atzmus is there, there's no existence of Eir at all. Ki'im ha'atzmus levad. It's only atzmus itself. Okay, but we need to understand, what does this mean exactly? So is it Eir or not Eir? In level 2 at least, you say, okay, there's an existence called Eir, but this existence is completely aware that it's nothing of its own. It's completely a reflection of its source. But what is level 3? If there's not Eir, it's only Atzmus, so then why is it Eir? So you're talking about Atzmus. Of course, there's Atzmus is higher than everything. Where do you see, how could you call it Eir and say it's not Eir, but only Atzmus? Well, clearly he's going to explain that the bitl is so deep that the Eir, not only does it see that it's dependent on the source, it doesn't even see itself as an entity altogether. Its entire existence is only Atzmus. Whereas in level 2, it's an entity, but the entity is completely dependent on the source. Now, of course, we're going to explain this and we'll go through it. So if you don't understand it yet, I don't either. But let's see what he's going to say, and then we'll elaborate. But I will also say one thing to make it a little easier. Remember when we spoke about the bitl of Nevroim, we didn't say Nevroim don't exist. We exist, we're a yesh. And bitl hayesh entails what? That we contemplate that existence has to have a creator. And all the proofs that we discussed. But you don't say that you don't exist. You say you can't exist without a creator. In the second level of Eir, it's deeper. It's bitl hametzias mamish, because the Eir, its whole existence, it feels as nothing of its own. It's only due to atzmus. But due to atzmus, it does exist. And this third level is going to tell us that it's such a deep bitl that there's a seamlessness, that there's no consciousness of Eir altogether. The Eir, all it is atzmus expressing itself. Not an Eir that's an expression of atzmus, but all it is atzmus expressing itself. Now, we'll discuss and explain what this means, but let's see what the Rebbe Rashab will say now. He's going to explain. He says, V'yesh levayir zeh. He obviously realizes the Rebbe Rashab, he knows that we have to explain this. So he says, we can explain this. V'yesh levayir zeh means it's the Rebbe Rashab's explanation. You can explain it al pi ma shekosev b'sefer shel beinim b'chelik beis. According to what it says in Tanya, section 2, which is Shar HaYichud v'Hamuna. The Rebbe already points out why Sefer Shel Beinim seems to be only the first Sefer, the first Chelik, Likutei Amorim. But in many places, Tanya is referred to Sefer Shel Beinim, Chelik Beis, which is Shar Yichud v'Hamuna. So what does he say there? So we're going to understand what we're discussing here according to what it says there, Be'inyan Bittul HaNevroim. So there he discusses the Shar Yichud v'Hamuna, the Bittul of Nevroim. I'll just say, I'll read it and I'll explain in a moment. So he says like this. What do we learn there? Al pi ma shekosav la'elam Hashem dvarcha nitzav b'shamayim. Right in the beginning of Shar Yichud v'Hamuna, the Alter Rebbe brings the pasuk, and the Baal Shem Tov's Pirush explanation on the pasuk, la'elam Hashem dvarcha nitzav b'shamayim. So the literal meaning of the verses that God's words are forever embedded or standing, nitzav are embedded in Shamayim, in heaven. Says the Baal Shem Tov, the Alter Rebbe cites this in Shar Yichud v'Hamuna. The Pirush Baal Shem Tov Zal, and the Baal Shem Tov explains this. Ki dvorcha she'amarta yehi rakia b'toich hamayim. That the word dvorcha, when you say dvorcha nitzav b'shamayim, the word is standing in Shamayim. So the Baal Shem Tov teaches the dvarcha, your words that you said yehi rakia in the Chumash, when we say after the second day of creation, it says vayemer elikim yehi rakia. Those words, may there be a firmament, a heaven. It says those are the words that you, God, said dvarcha yehi rakia b'teich hamayim, within the water. Everything was covered in water, And God said, Yehirakia, may there be a firmament, a heaven should appear, should emerge, should be from within the water, so that the Baal Shem Tov teaches, Tevis ve'esius elu, these words and these letters of Yehirakia, the words uttered by God in Asar Mamaris, in the words that God said, Yehirakia, these words and letters, elu, Tevis ve'elu, nitzaves, they stand, well, nitzaves means they stand firm, they're firmly implanted, ve'em des, and stand la'elam, that's the word la'elam. La'elam Hashem dvarcha v'nitzah b'shamayim means forever. They always are standing there. They're permanently embedded there. B'teich rekiah shamayim. Within the actual rekiah shamayim, these words and letters are constantly vivifying and energizing the heaven itself. And then he continues. All this is from Tanya. V'iloi hoya mistalkis. If these letters would be removed, they would be removed from heaven. In other words, the heaven itself has letters and words that are energizing and giving them existence. If the letters of Yehirakia would be mistalkas, would expire or be removed for 1 second, chaz v'shalom, God forbid, and they would return to their source. In other words, God would cease speaking. He would cease saying Yehirakia, which is completely being repeated again and again. La'elam, hoyukola shamayim ayin ve'efesh mamish. All of heaven would become ayin ve'efesh, would become non-existent. So, for example, when we do something, we don't have that type of power, creative power. But there are examples for it. For example, if I stop speaking right now, there'll be no more words from my mouth. Imagine if my words created something, so whatever I created would cease to be because there's no more that speaking. Like the famous story, the anecdote that's told, that a teacher asked students, so one who learned Chassidus and one who didn't learn Chassidus, if God wanted to destroy the world, or two rabbis, they say, one learned Chassidus, one didn't. If God wanted to eliminate the world, what would he do? So one said, we look in Chumash, he would bring a mabul, a flood, then he'd bring a fire, so he'd kill all life, and then fire, and then scatter all the pieces. And the one who learned Chassidus and Shaykh Vamuna answered very straightforward. If God wanted to destroy the world, he would do only one thing. It's called nothing. He would stop speaking. He would stop breathing. He would stop willing the creation. So it's not just semantics, it's a very different way of looking at it. So that's what he says here. That your words are always standing within the firmament, within the heaven. And should these letters be removed, even for 1 second, everything would cease to be as if it never existed. So what do we derive from this? So he says, V'im kain, based on this, if this is the case, V'im kain, Gam be'es mitziyusei, also during the existence, because right now the letters were not removed. They're there. They're energizing the heaven and giving it existence. So he's saying, even while it's existing with the letters of God, the divine letters and words that are energizing it, he says, Gam be'es mitziyusei, even during the time, the period that it is existing, Ma'u mitziyusei be'emes, what is its true existence? It's only the divine power that's bringing it into being, that's bringing it into existence. Because it doesn't have anything of its own. And the fact that we see that the existence of a yesh, there is a heaven, there's an actual heaven, who bottled b'mitzias mamish, it's entirely nullified, literally nullified. Ma'acha shebilodei haruchnius, hainu hakoyach alikia mahava, she'en esis dasar mamoris, which means that without the ruchnius, which means what? The letters, the divine force, the divine power that creates, that brings them into being, which are the letters of the 10 utterances, the 10 statements, Asara Mamaris, Haya Ayin Ve'efes Mamish K'may Kedim Sheshish Bereshis Mamish. They're Ayin Ve'efes, like nullified and completely nullified, exactly as it was before creation, Mamish. And this ruchnis, which means the spiritual energy of the Asara Mamaris, that flows, that flows upon it. It alone is the one that is continuously drawing it out from a state of nothingness to a state of somethingness. And it creates it and it keeps it, sustains it. Im kain efes bilode. So that's the case. Efes bilode. There's nothing bilode without it. When, for example, you take a piece of gold, or a piece of clay, or a piece of cloth, and a tailor makes from it a garment. So once the garment is made, you can purchase it, and it's yours. You don't need the tailor to constantly be there to continuously keep the garment together. Why? Because it's yesh miyesh. Because the tailor did not create the material. The created the garment. He took material and reshaped it. So you can't say that the garment is dependent on, and its entire existence is dependent on the tailor. No. The tailor was just a facilitator that reshaped something. Existence, on the other hand, doesn't have anything of its own. The material itself, something put it there, and it keeps it alive all the time. Take away the creative force, the material disappears. In this case, take away the creative force, the words of Yehirakia, and the heaven disappears. So what can you say about the existence of heaven itself? That it doesn't have any existence of its own. Its entire existence is simply God speaking Yehirakia, that takes the shape of a heaven. But in truth, the whole heaven is just what he calls Batel b'Mitzias Mamish, because its whole existence is dependent on this energy. Take away the energy, there's no existence. So based on this, he's now going to come explain Efes Biltecha, the third type of bitl of Eir. So he's going to say it like this. U'kamoy ken yesh lemer. And the same thing, yesh lemer, we can say, Ba'a'ir, Inyan de Efes Bilode. We could say the same thing in Eir, the Inyan that we're speaking about, Efes Bilode, the third level, that Efes, nothing, Bilode, without him. Or Efes Biltecha, and not you. Here he's saying Bilode, without him. Dahainu, this means, Sha'ir ha-nimtza min ha'atzmus, the air that emerges, that is nimtza, that exists, it's drawn out from atzmus, or comes, or exists, nimtza, comes into existence from atzmus, hu batel b'metzias mamish. It's completely nullified, literally, the eina nimtza raka atzmus. And the only thing that exists is atzmus, not the oir. So he's equating these two stages, these two entities, that just like the Rakia does not exist because its entire existence is its divine energy within it, he's saying Oyer does not exist because its whole existence is Atzmus, that's giving it reality. But he's going to now make a distinction between the two. He says, the difference is, however, Rak b'mitzias hayesh, b'mitzias yesh, the existence of Yesh, Liyash and Imtzim b'bchinas Mitzias, being that the Yesh God wants it to be a Mitzias, an actual heaven, a sky, a Shamayim. Tzrichim leimer the mashanim zu b'chinas yesh hu batel mitzias mamish. So you have to say there that the fact that it exists a yesh, that yesh is batel b'mitzias mamish, is mamish batel, but you can't say it's not a mitzias. I'm not sure if what I just said is correct. I want to read on before I explain. Let me see. Oyer was never created to be a Metzias Dover, an existing like a heaven. It's Ayin in the first place. It's completely Ayin. And therefore its bittul is that it's not at all a Metzias. Its whole Metzias is Atzmus. Okay. What he's saying is like this. Let me explain. I know it could sound quite cryptic. What is exactly the difference? He says like this. The example from Shar Yichad V'Amunah has something in common with Oyer and something not in common. What is it? What is he using Shar Yichad V'Amunah to just explain one thing? Not to compare Yesh to Oyer, the heaven to Oyer, but rather to explain how when something is completely dependent on its source, it has no existence of its own. All it is the source expressing itself. So in the case of Yesh, the heaven, Yehirakia, once you know that La'elam Hashem Dvarcha Nitzah B'Shamayim, that the heaven itself, all it is divine expression saying Yehirakia. So therefore, what you see in existence, all it is divine expression, except it's taking on a shape of a heaven. And you have to therefore say the heaven is not Batel B'Mitzias Mamish, because its entire existence is only God's expression. In that sense, you could say it's similar to Oyer, because Oyer is the same thing. All it is divine expression. The difference, however, and not anything of its own, but there's a difference. The divine expression in Rakia ends up being an entity called a heaven. It's not a fake entity. It's not an illusion. It's a yesh called Rakia. But you learn that this whole yesh is completely dependent on, and therefore all it is, divine expression is a yesh. Oyer never was a yesh in the first place. The divine expression of Oyer is basically the divine expressing itself, but not in any form of a Metzias, because Oyer is not a Metzias. So what does Oyer feel? Rakia has a function. The Shemayim has a function. However, its function and its existence is completely dependent on its source. And therefore, its whole existence is due to the source. In Oyer, since it does not have a function and does not have an existence in any form that you call a Metzias, then the only thing is divine expression, period. But it is expression. That's why it's called Oyer. It's expression because it's ultimately God expressing himself, except Oyer does not have anything else but being the expression of the divine. The Rakia is also only divine expression, but it does have the entity itself is there because that's what God wants to express. He wants a heaven to do what a heaven does. He wants the sun to shine. They have specific functions. That's how I initially understand what he's trying to say here. Not clear completely, but at least pshat. We'll go over it again. I want to obviously continue, but maybe we'll stop here. I would just give one example, and then we'll stop here and we'll read it further tomorrow. You know, I think to explain it, it'd be good to use an example about us. If you remember when we talked before about the contemplation, that when we think about creation itself and its perpetuation, you come to the conclusion that there must be a creator. But you don't come to the conclusion necessarily that existence doesn't exist. You could say existence cannot exist without a creator, but it doesn't say anywhere you don't exist. A deeper level is coming to understand that existence itself is just divine energy in the shape of what our physical eyes call existence. So it exists, but all it is divine energy. That's not what we come to in Ein Zuloscha, in the second level. It's on the third level. So when we talk about Oyer, in this level, I'll just use the example of a shliach. We learned, the Rebbe brings different levels that a shliach can be. You make a shliach, and all he is just an extension of your arm. You say, listen, I want you to bring a contract to a third party. You're my shliach, a shliach, let's say, kedushin. You bring a marriage contract to a potential wife. And once you do, she's married, not to the shliach, obviously, to shluchei shalom k'meisei, to the mishaleach. But you don't say the shliach doesn't exist. He's clearly an entity, except for this moment, he has committed himself to do what the mishaleach, the sender, wants, but he remains an independent citizen, an independent entity. The only thing that's required is that he commits himself to doing what the mishaleach wants, and that's that. And then after that, it's over with. His whole existence, he may have other jobs to do. He may be a whole other person that's nothing to do with the mishaleach. That's the first level of bittul. The second level is no. His existence, his entire existence is committed now, not just his arm, but his whole being, his mind, and so on. He's become like a power of attorney. The Mishaleach gave him power of attorney. A little like maybe like Eliezer Eved Avram. I'm not sure if exactly that's the case, but power of attorney is much more than just you did one act, and you are now essentially like the Mishaleach, but you're still a separate entity. Then there's a point, and therefore it has certain elements to that. You can use your mind to figure out a solution. He's giving you the power of attorney to solve a problem. In level 3, Efes Biltecha, there's nothing but the Mishaleach. Your entire existence doesn't matter, is not significant. All you are is the Mishaleach himself, and that's all that's sensed. There's no separate entity that's bottle. It is sensing purely the source itself. Now, how would that have, what implications would that have? Maybe one would be where you can't even distinguish between the shliach and the mishaleach, where number 2, you could distinguish between them, except there's, as I said, his whole existence is due. In the third level, the mishaleach doesn't feel any sense of self altogether. There's no self. There's no self that's dependent on and saying, I only exist due to my source. You don't even have that. There is nothing but the source. So essentially, it's really one entity that's just expressing itself. All I am is like the mouthpiece expression of the Mishaleach in this case. I need to further think it through and explain it more, but that's just a beginning of trying to understand the difference between 3 and 2. Well, we also have to understand the difference between heaven, Ayesh, and Eir, though he brings this comparison, is like I said, one is a Metzias that's completely bottle, and the other was not a Metzias in the first place, like he says. These words. Where you cannot say that on Rakia. Rakia is not Atzmus. Rakia is an expression of Atzmus, like a Rakia. He Rakia. Oyer, on the other hand, is never an entity in its first place, so therefore all it is expression of Atzmus, similar to the difference between the chief of staff, let's say, and the department heads. The department heads each have their function, but their function is completely dependent on their source. The chief of staff is nothing, no function altogether. All it is the king speaking through him. He's like a megaphone, a amplifier. completely just an expression of something greater than he is, with no self altogether. But we need more discussion, obviously, about this, and we'll discuss it more